During these days, the armed forces of Ukraine hit 3 Russian command posts, 3 ammunition storage points as well as a Russian S-300 air defense system. Ukraine's rocket forces and artillery units struck 3 Russian command posts, 3 clusters of the occupiers' manpower and military equipment, a Russian S-300 air defense system and 3 ammunition storage points. Ukrainian aircraft carried out 15 strikes on clusters of Russian military manpower as well as 5 attacks on Russian anti-aircraft missile system positions over the last 24 hours. In addition, Ukrainian defenders shot down a Russian Su-25 attack aircraft in the east of the country and an Orlan-10 UAV in the south. Over the last 24 hours, Russians conducted 5 missile strikes on the peaceful cities of Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk and Zaporizhia, as well as 12 airstrikes. They fired 4 times using multiple launch rocket systems, hitting civilian infrastructure in Kharkiv, Donetsk and Kherson oblasts particularly. The Russians continue to focus their main efforts on attempts to occupy Donetsk Oblast within its administrative border and continue to advance on the Bakhmut front. The fiercest fighting continues in the areas of Soledar, Pereskovivka, Bakhmut and Klishchivka. The Russians are conducting unsuccessful offensive actions on the Avdiivka front, and they are trying to improve their tactical position on the Kupiansk and Lyman fronts. On the Novopavlivka, Zaporizhia, and Kherson fronts, the Russians are on the defensive. There are no significant changes on the Volyn, Polishcha, Sivershchina and Slobozhenskina fronts. No signs of the formation of Russian offensive groups were detected. On the Sivershchina and Slobozhenskina fronts, Russian forces fired on the settlements of Senkivka and Karpovichi in Chernihiv Oblast, Bachivsk in Sumy Oblast, as well as Streleka, Zilin, Haidish, Vovchansk, Chuhanivka and Rydkadub in Kharkiv Oblast. On the Kupiansk front, Russian troops fired in and around Senkivka, Orlyanka, Kislivka, Berestov, Ivanivka and Bohuskavka in Kharkiv Oblast, and Stelmakivka in Luhansk Oblast. On the Lyman front, Kharkivka, Makiivka, Chervenopapivka and Dybrova in Luhansk Oblast were shelled. On the Bakhmut front, Russian troops hit the areas in and around Spern, Bilohorivka, Soledar, Krasna Ora, Pidhorodin, Bakhmut, Klishchivka, Kurdyamivka, Druzhba and Pivnikn in Donetsk Oblast. On the Avdiivka front, Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, Marinka and Novomykhailivka in Donetsk Oblast came under Russian fire. On the Novopavlivka front, Vuhledar, Prikostivka and Zolota Niva in Donetsk Oblast were hit. On the Zaporizhia front, areas of Remivka and Vilnpol in Donetsk Oblast and Huliapol, Chervon, Chernihiv, Malotokmachka, Orakhiv and Kamyansk in Zaporizhia Oblast came under fire. On the Kherson front, the Russian forces do not stop attacking the settlements along the right bank of the Dnipro River. In particular, Kherson was attacked with mortars. The Russian occupiers continue to loot the property of the local population in the temporarily occupied territory of Kherson Oblast. The occupation authorities announced an inventory of movable and immovable property owned by local private entrepreneurs, with subsequent so-called nationalization in one of the settlements of the Kakhovka district. To replenish the losses in manpower, the Russians do not stop mobilizing the male population, in particular in the temporarily occupied territory of Luhansk Oblast. Thus, the start of the next wave of mobilization has been recorded in the city of Alchevsk since January 9 of this year. Meanwhile, Ukraine is struggling to evacuate nearly 600 people, including children, from the mining town of Soledar, where efforts continue to repel Russian troops. Russian forces have also likely pushed Ukrainian soldiers out of the western outskirts of the settlement, according to the US-based think tank the Institute for the Study of War. It added that some Russian sources claimed that Russian forces are still clearing Soledar of remaining Ukrainian forces as of yesterday. Russian military bloggers have also posted footage yesterday showing Wagner Group fighters freely walking in Soledar and claimed that they visited the settlement alongside Russian forces. However, Moscow has not officially announced the capture of long-contested territory, which it believes will catapult Russian forces towards capturing Bakhmut in a bloodied siege. The New York Times accidentally published the phone numbers of Russian soldiers critical of Vladimir Putin in the metadata of a September 2022 exposé, Motherboard reports. Ukrainian forces are holding their positions in the besieged town of Soledar and are inflicting significant losses on Russia troops, President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed. Moscow is seeking to capture the town near Bakhmut, in what would mark its first significant gain in months, and the Wagner mercenary group claimed to have seized it earlier today, while a Russian installed official in Donetsk region said pockets of resistance remained. As fighting rages for control of Soledar, as many as 559 civilians, including 15 children, remained in the city and could not be evacuated, Donetsk Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko has warned. Ukraine has acknowledged Russian advances on the besieged city, which Moscow seeks as its most significant gain since a series of retreats late last year. Russian soldiers are moving over their own corpses in the push for the city, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said on Thursday, adding fighting was still fierce. Russia's persistent troubles in Ukraine likely led to latest shakeup in military leadership, the Pentagon has said, urging Moscow to end the war instead of turning to new generals. Russia has said its forces are edging closer to capturing a salt mining town in eastern Ukraine, which would mark an elusive victory for the Kremlin but at the cost of heavy Russian casualties and extensive destruction of the territory. Ukraine's Donetsk Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko said in televised remarks that more than 100 Russian troops have been killed in the battle for Soledar over the past 24 hours. Russian forces are using mortars and rockets to bombard Soledar in an unrelenting assault, battling for a breakthrough after military setbacks have turned what the Kremlin hoped would be a fast victory into a grinding war of attrition that has dragged on for nearly 11 months. Soldar's fall would be a prize for a Kremlin starved of good battlefield news in recent months, after losing the significant city of Kherson in December. The Russian tactic in the assault on Soledar is to send one or two waves of soldiers, many from the private Russian military contractor Wagner Group, who take heavy casualties as they probe the defenses, a Ukrainian officer near Soledar told the Associated Press. When Ukrainian troops suffer casualties and are exhausted, the Russians send in another wave of highly trained soldiers, paratroopers or special forces, to get a new foothold on the battlefield, said the Ukrainian source. Putin launched the invasion on February 24, saying Kyiv's ties with the West threatened Russia's security. Ukraine and its allies call it an unprovoked war to seize territory. In Kherson City, recaptured by Ukrainian forces in November, prosecutors said they were investigating at least 10 sites where Russian occupiers had tortured hundreds of Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin has authorized another shakeup in the military leadership leading the invasion of Ukraine, while Kyiv mocked claims that it had lost the town of Soledar, which is at the center of a furious Russian assault. Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu announced that Valery Gerasimov, chief of the general staff, has been appointed as overall commander of forces in Ukraine, one of a number of changes in recent months as Mr. Putin seeks a success story to sell at home. It is clear that pressure is building on the Kremlin, with the move in effect demoting Gen. Sergei Surovikin, who had been named Russia's top battlefield commander in Ukraine only last October after a spate of offensives by Kyiv's troops that turned the tide of the war. Russia and its close ally Belarus have beefed up their joint military grouping in Belarus and plan to hold joint aviation drills there from next Monday. The exercises form part of a pattern of activity that has prompted Ukraine to warn that Russian President Vladimir Putin may try to use Belarus to launch a new ground invasion of Ukraine from the north. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko allowed Putin to use his country as one of the launchpads to invade Ukraine last February, when Russian forces were beaten back in an attempt to take the capital Kyiv. Military analysts say Russia has also used Belarusian facilities to train up newly mobilized soldiers who were called up last September to boost its forces in Ukraine. However, Belarus has not sent its own troops into Ukraine in support of Russia's special military operation there. The Kremlin and Russian Defense Ministry have remained quiet on the situation around the town. In its daily military briefing on Thursday, the Russian Defense Ministry said only that offensive actions in the Donetsk region were continuing successfully, with no reference to Soledar. A Russian Defense Ministry statement said its latest command reshuffle was meant to improve contacts between military branches and the effectiveness of the command structure. Those included a Ukrainian attack on a Russian barracks that killed at least 89 Russian soldiers over New Year's. Surovikin was ordered to head the campaign after Ukrainian offensives turned the tide of the war and drew attention to poor training, equipment and morale among Russian forces. If pro-Russian forces succeed in taking Soledar, it would be a stepping stone in Moscow's thrust to capture Ukraine's eastern Donbas industrial region. The town would be a base to attack the nearby city of Bakhmut, a supply line hub in eastern Ukraine, where defenders have held out for months. Combatants from the notorious Wagner group of mercenaries, led by Vladimir Putin ally Yevgeny Prigozhin, declared late on Tuesday that they had taken control of the eastern mining town in the Donetsk region, home to what is said to be Europe's largest salt mine and, prior to the war, a population of around 10,000 people. Were Russian forces to definitively secure Soledar, it would mark its first meaningful territorial gain since last summer. Russia has been forced into several humiliating retreats in the north, northeast and south since then as Ukraine mounted an impressive counterattack in the autumn. The Russian and Ukrainian human rights commissioners agreed to swap more than 40 military prisoners, Turkey's state-run Anadolu agency quoted the Russian official as saying. The two warring parties have exchanged prisoners multiple times, in one of the few areas of cooperation. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said his country has proposed establishing a corridor to bring the wounded to Turkey for treatment. Vladimir Putin has authorized another shakeup in the military leadership leading the invasion of Ukraine, while Kyiv mocked claims that it had lost the town of Soledar, which is at the center of a furious Russian assault. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced that Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff, had been appointed as overall commander of forces in Ukraine, one of a number of changes in recent months as Mr. Putin seeks a success story to sell at home. It is clear that pressure is building on the Kremlin, with the move in effect demoting General Sergei Surovikin, who had been named Russia's top battlefield commander in Ukraine only last October after a spate of offensives by Kyiv's troops that turned the tide of the war. General Surovikin had earned the nickname General Armageddon from the Russian media for his reputed ruthlessness. Russia's defense ministry said on Wednesday that Russian airborne units had surrounded the Ukrainian town of Soledar from the north and south, while Russia's air force struck Ukrainian positions in the town, Russian agencies reported. In its daily briefing, the defense ministry said that Russian assault units were fighting for Soledar, a small town in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region that has been the focus of fierce fighting for months. Ukraine's military denied on Wednesday that Russian forces had taken control of the eastern town of Soledar, and said the intensity of battles in the area could be compared to fighting in World War II. Serhiy Cherevatiy, spokesperson for the Eastern Military Command, told Ukrainian television the battle for Soledar was important and that Ukrainian forces had not allowed Russian forces to break through front lines. In their January 12 update, the General Staff of the Armed Forces reported that Ukraine's rocket and artillery forces hit 3 Russian control centers, 3 temporary bases, an S-300 missile system, and 3 ammunition depots. According to the Ukrainian military, the Russian army launched 5 missiles on cities in Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts, 12 airstrikes, and 4 MLRS attacks. The General Staff added that the fiercest fighting is currently happening in the Soledar, Bakhmut, Pereskovivka, and Klishchivka areas in Donetsk Oblast. Earlier in the day, President Volodymyr Zelensky pledged that the units defending Bakhmut and Soledar would be provided with ammunition and everything necessary, promptly and uninterruptedly. Also, on January 12, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces reported that over 100 Russian soldiers had been killed in the Battle of Soledar after Ukrainian forces launched a missile strike. On the previous day, Zelensky said Soledar is almost completely destroyed, but the fighting continues, and the eastern front line is holding. The comment came after Russia claimed to take control over the city and later denied it. Soledar is located just above Bakhmut, also under siege as Russia looks to capture the area as part of its larger goal of taking control of the entirety of Donetsk Oblast, which it has partly occupied since 2014. The invading troops have also lost a total of over 20,000 units of equipment. Russia attacked Ukraine on February 24. January 12 marks the 323rd day of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Invading Russian forces initially tried to advance from the north, east and south, attacking peaceful cities throughout Ukraine. Civilian targets across Ukrainian cities continue to be subject to sporadic Russian airstrikes, while settlements along the Russian border are regularly shelled. Since October, Russia has also been hitting Ukrainian cities with Iranian-made kamikaze drones. During this time, the Kremlin has changed its war goals in Ukraine several times. After the failed operation to seize Kyiv, Russian troops retreated from Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy oblasts to concentrate on fighting for the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts that were under Ukrainian control before the full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian armed forces have launched a counteroffensive in the south and east of Ukraine, striking at Russian ammunition depots and troop concentrations. Shortly after the beginning of the Kherson counteroffensive, the Ukrainian army launched another counteroffensive in Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast of the country. Most of the oblast was liberated from Russian occupation in just a few days. On November 11, the Ukrainian military also liberated Kherson and drove the occupying troops from the west bank of Kherson Oblast. The armed forces of Ukraine are also gradually liberating Luhansk Oblast. After Russian troops fled Kherson, there was an upsurge in fighting in Donetsk Oblast. Since October, the Russian military has targeted critical infrastructure facilities across Ukraine, depriving the population of regular supplies of power, water, and heating during winter. Pristeko commented on the situation in Soledar, where fierce fighting is currently taking place, and said that the town is completely destroyed, and the Russian forces are losing hundreds of soldiers in an attempt to present some kind of win to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Earlier, former chief of the British General Staff Richard Danitz said that London needs to send up to 50 Challenger 2 tanks to really change the situation in Ukraine. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief, Lieutenant General Valery Zaluzhnyi, said that he would need 300 Western main battle tanks to be able to defeat Russia. On January 11, the British government confirmed for the first time that it plans to send 10 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine to protect it from Russian aggression. Polish President Andrzej Duda announced on January 11 that Warsaw would send a company of Leopard tanks to Ukraine as part of an international coalition. The number was not directly specified, but a company of Polish tanks numbers 14 vehicles. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked his ally, but stressed that one state with Leopards will not be able to help, adding that Ukraine expects a joint decision from a group of countries. On January 12, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that heavy fighting continues near Soledar in Donetsk Oblast, as Russian troops are unsuccessfully trying to break through the defense of the Ukrainian military. In the first weeks of 2023, Russia devoted maximum efforts to trying to capture Soledar, but Ukrainian defenders continue to defend the settlement. Despite the extreme pressure of enemy attacks and statements of Russian propaganda, the Ukrainian command denied rumors of the capture of Soledar. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that the enemy is trying to take control of Soledar and supply routes for Ukrainian units, but is suffering heavy losses. Soledar is located about 13 kilometers to the northeast from Bakhmut. It is another town in the east of Ukraine almost completely destroyed by the occupying forces during their numerous attempts to seize it over the past several months. The population of the town before the full-scale invasion was 11,000 citizens, most of whom have fled. Regular artillery shelling from the very start of the invasion has left Soledar largely deserted. Artemsil, the largest salt factory in Europe, is located in the town, but it has not been operating since April 2022. A year ago, Ukraine's economy was on a strong footing, with a debt to GDP of less than 50% and a budget deficit of 3.5%. Then came February 24, and with it a full-scale war. Months of war have transformed Ukraine from a country with stable and promising financial indicators to one that is directing all resources to the struggle while battling severe economic consequences: 30% economic decline, inflation around 28%, up to 8 million refugees, unemployment of about 30%, and hundreds of destroyed or damaged businesses and industries. At the beginning of the Russian invasion, international partners verified our budget deficit at $5 billion per month for the rest of 2022. As of early December, we had received just over $28 billion out of that required $50 billion, and the National Bank of Ukraine had to print $12 billion more. In 2023, the state budget deficit of Ukraine will reach $38 billion. The constant massive missile attacks across Ukraine mean the reconstruction bill and economic losses will keep growing in 2023. The support of international partners will play a crucial role in how we get through the 2023 budget year. We welcome the U.S. intention to continue providing grants to Ukraine, as well as the European Commission's proposal to launch a new full-scale macrofinancial assistance program for Ukraine in 2023. But as the war drags on, this is not enough. Russia's war doesn't just affect Ukraine's economy. The economic consequences have been global. Many countries are facing the highest inflation in decades, huge energy costs, and threats of recession. Russia and the European Union have been using energy imports and exports as weapons in a Pyrrhic war of wills since Russia invaded Ukraine early last year. Until recently, the European Union imported almost half of its natural gas supply from Russia, making European energy demand a vital component of Russia's economic well-being, while also rendering the EU dangerously vulnerable to the whims of Russian President Vladimir Putin's volatile authoritarian regime and NBSP. Putin had counted on skyrocketing energy prices over the winter months to fund Russia's costly war in Ukraine. That bet has not panned out, to say the least. Last month, Russia's fossil fuel export revenues fell 17%, reaching their lowest level since before the war began. The EU's most recent round of sanctions have also hit their target, Since December, Russia's net energy export revenues declined €160 million, $172 million, a day.